I'm Tamsin Newlands, and I am the granddaughter of Robert John Newlands, who is the poet and author of Milton, which was published last year by Valley Press on the centenary of his birth. He was born in 1922, and he was born on a croft, which was about a few miles away from a town called Keith in Scotland, where he was the youngest of 10 children, and he lived with all his siblings and his mother and father on this croft, where they didn't have amenities like heating, gas, electric, or telephone. So it was a very impoverished upbringing, but it was a very happy time. And he also went to a school in Keith which also feels like it was a happy education, where he was taught by teachers who fought in the First World War, who were likely injured during the First World War. And there was a lot of respect for the teachers during that time. When he was 16, he went on to work at a solicitor's office for 3 years, and then the Second World War began, and he volunteered to join the RAF when he was 19, and he was stationed, after training to be a wireless technician, he was stationed in Eastbourne, which is where I am today, and he did that for 5 years. But after the war, which he finished his post in 1946. He went on, because there was an emergency, there was a shortage for teachers at the time. He went on to do an emergency 1-year teacher training where his main subject was English, which is what he went on to teach. But he also trained in religious education, which no doubt had an influence in his teaching, and was a subject that he loved very much. He loved, no question that he loved poetry, and as in his upbringing he didn't have many books, so as he grew older he would buy any poetry book that he could find, and a lot of his understanding of poetry, his love of poetry, was self-taught and influenced by many writers who most likely influenced his long poem Milton Row. He went on to become a teacher well into his 60s, and we are very lucky that a distant cousin, who Robert John Newlands didn't meet, but Mary Ann Newlands' Case, has illustrated this long poem. We think these illustrations really complement the narrative, the story, and there's a real feel of a likeness to my grandfather. Through Mary Ann had photographs, so there's a very sort of personal element to this poem. So we're very excited that Mary Ann is also part of this. There is no question that many of the poets that my granddad enjoyed reading have influenced the way that he's written this poem. It's all completely in rhyming couplets, which reflects the writing of Dryden and Pope, and where there is very much a strict regular beat of the iambic pentameter, which is 10 beats per line, dee-dum, 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 and it never goes into the 11 or 12 beats, so there aren't any feminine endings or kind of changes within that structure. And I like to feel like it's this heartbeat and this sort of a living beat of London, of the movement of London, which is reflected in it. And there's a lot of different techniques that my granddad plays with, this feeling of the enjambment, so travelling over the thought over to the next lines, and sometimes he crosses over to 2 or 3 lines, which again gives this feeling of movement of the story and the sort of giving momentum, this drive, which, without giving anything away, really complements that moment of climax towards the end of the story. So this feeling of pace and this feeling of movement. And as a reader, I also feel like you can be sort of moved about as you're reading, even within the strict structure, with the playing of caesura, which is the suspension in the middle of the line. So there's a real sense of, I guess, being jolted about and really living in the kind of chaos of the school and the chaos of London. It's clear from reading the poem that there is a great sense of, it's an outpouring of frustration and anger against a schooling system which feels like it wasn't listening, or it feels like it didn't care about the students. So that really, as you read this poem, there's very much that sense of railing against those systems and those higher powers that just refuse to change or refuse to reflect on standards, and he felt frustrated by that because then that was causing, he felt that that was influencing the behaviour of the students and also the tension between the teachers and the students. And because he felt, well, I believe that he felt that this wasn't to do with, because of, you know, their deprived backgrounds. That wasn't the reason for the behaviour and the violence that was happening within the poem and within the school, but was more to do with the fact that the schooling system was failing these students. And I think he felt very passionate about that. The poem is divided into 3 parts, and the first part is very much the telling of characterising who these characters are, and they're very expressive and they're very vivid, particularly of the head teacher, which is sort of both sort of interlayered with moments of humour, but also the sense of this atmosphere of something that's feeling quite depressive, depressive with the schooling system, depressive within the classroom, and also depressive with the whole system, which he felt powerless towards. So they're very, very clear descriptions of the students, of the pupils, and the relationship between the teacher and the students. The second section pulls slightly away from the story and feels more like a more outward look of different systems and different attitudes. And the third is returning back to the story, which leads up to the climax of the story, which almost feels or harks to a Greek tragedy, I feel. It just really builds up to that moment of, a moment of shock. And I think the message that my grandfather wanted to convey was he really wanted to show that it wasn't because the students' behaviour or the violence within the story isn't because of the students' deprived backgrounds. It isn't because of to do with money. It was to do because, and he knew that because he himself came from a very impoverished background. He believed it was to do with a system that was failing them, and it was a system that wasn't wanting to listen to change. So there is this sense of white hot anger, which I hope that you can feel throughout, to really convey a sense of powerlessness. So I hope you've enjoyed this little bit more information about Milton Rowe and who my grandfather was. Some of you have already given us some of your thoughts, which have been brilliant, where some of you have been quite shocked that the 60s, which often give this impression of being a glorious time, was very different. And it's also been really interesting to hear people say how some of the themes that were addressed in the poem have also some relevance to what's happening today. So please let us know your thoughts. Enjoy reading the poem, and thank you.